Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are frequently referred to as the Abrahamic traditions. And the reason will be quite clear as we begin to look at this section on Islam. It's pretty clear why Judaism would be an Abrahamic tradition. It's with Abraham that God establishes his covenant, and that's where we begin the story of Islam. So in the Hebrew Bible, we read about this covenant being established with Abraham back when he lives in the city of Ur in contemporary Iraq. God tells him to go to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great and mighty nation, and you will have descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens. So he goes at the age of 75 with his wife Sarah, who is barren, so they are both childless, and they eventually make their way to the general vicinity of the Holy Land, and he's a wandering semi-nomadic shepherd, but he does do very well, and he makes for himself maybe not quite a great and mighty nation, but he owns a large number of flocks, and he has all kinds of people working for him, and they move around in certain areas that they don't exactly own, but they have certain rights to graze there. And so he's financially doing quite well, but it's 10 years later, and Sarah and Abraham are both in their 80s, and they're not quite sure how, after all these years, Sarah would bear him a child. And so that's where the narrative begins that I've put online here, where Sarah says, why don't you sleep with my handmaiden Hagar, and perhaps we can build a family through her. And indeed, Abraham does sleep with her, and she becomes pregnant. And when she's pregnant, there's some conflict between her and Sarah. Sarah is presumably feeling that Hagar will have the child, but she will serve as the mother, effectively being the matriarch of this tribe, and Hagar being a slave. But at the same time, Abraham perhaps is a little bit close with Hagar, and perhaps that's disturbing to Sarah, and perhaps because of that, Hagar feels a little bit like her status has been raised, and therefore maybe is unhappy with being treated the way she had been when she was merely a handmaid that was technically a slave. A little bit different understanding of slavery in this time, but nonetheless a slave. So Sarah gets mad and tells Abraham that this is all his fault, and he says, well, look, you do with her whatever you want. And then Sarah mistreats her, we're told explicitly in the Bible. So what that means exactly, perhaps she maybe has her beaten or something, we don't know exactly what, but she mistreats her. And so Hagar runs away, and is not sure what to do. She's pregnant, and she's quite upset and doesn't know where to go, what to do. And an angel comes and visits her, and the angel says, you are pregnant, you will give birth to a son, you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will live in hostility toward all his brothers. So we have a prediction that doesn't sound particularly reassuring. Nonetheless, she is told that she should go back and endure the mistreatment of Sarah, and that her son will have an important future. So she goes back, and he is born, and some more years pass, and finally, when Abraham is 99 years old, and God comes and visits him and tells him that it's time, by this time next year, your wife Sarah will have a son, and his name will be Isaac. And Abraham is a little incredulous because Sarah is quite old and has been barren all of these years, and he's not sure that this is really going to happen, but God assures him that it will, and moreover, that it will be with his son through Sarah, Isaac, that he will establish the covenant. And so it's quite an interesting play that we have here, that technically Ishmael is the firstborn, and yet Isaac is treated as if he were the firstborn. And so there's all kinds of interesting things going on between who's the firstborn, who's not, and why is one of them given favor over the other. But the text makes clear, because Abraham repeatedly mentions it, that he is concerned for Ishmael's well-being, and God repeatedly assures him, don't worry, he will also be a great leader, and you don't have to worry about him, he'll be taken care of. So, of course, it comes to pass, and Sarah does bear him Isaac, and as Isaac grows older and is weaned, and so at this point perhaps Ishmael is maybe around 16 years old, maybe a little bit older, and at that point Sarah gets concerned, presumably that Ishmael might share in the inheritance of her son Isaac, not only the wealth but perhaps also the covenant promise of being the leader of a great nation. And so she demands of Abraham that he expel Hagar and Ishmael from the community. And Abraham is concerned about that, but God says, yeah, go ahead, do that, that's okay, don't worry, I'm taking care of them. And so he sends them off with a little bit of food and a little bit of water, and off into the desert they go. And then when the food and water run out, we have Hagar very upset, fearing death for her and her son, and she sits down and starts crying when an angel comes to her and then shows her, and suddenly there's a spring of water that wells up. And so you get a well in the middle of the desert there, and it saves her life. And so that's where I'm going to stop this part of the narrative. And we will go on and look at the same narrative from an Islamic position in the next mini lecture. But what I want to just stop and think about for a second here before moving on is, what exactly is going on in this story? And there's lots of ways perhaps it could be interpreted, but the basic idea here is that you have two groups of people who have essentially been fighting for thousands of years and are still fighting today. And that is to say that you have one group of people that regards itself as the primary descendants of Abraham through the firstborn lineage, in this case Isaac, even though he's technically not the firstborn. And that would be the people of Israel, the people that consider themselves Jewish. On the other hand, you have this reference to this other son that is somehow not quite legitimate and yet not entirely illegitimate either. And part of the story there is that Hagar was from Egypt and was a slave, and that's going to kind of be a precursor to what will later happen when the Jews end up as slaves in Egypt, and the Pharaoh has a hardened heart and won't let the people go and all of that. And so it's a bit of foreshadowing here about, you can't trust the Egyptians, something along those lines. There's not something quite right with them. And yet there is this sense that Ishmael is indeed legitimate, that this is not, there was nothing improper in what had happened, and this would not be, at the time, an unusual way to start a family if your primary wife hadn't had any children and you needed to have an heir. It was very important to pass on your heritage. And so what the narrative seems to be saying is that they are both in some sense legitimate, but they have to in some sense also be separated, and that Ishmael will also be a great nation, but but he will be a wild donkey of a man, and will have problems with the people around him. And perhaps from the Jewish perspective, it's almost the opposite. It's almost that they are the lone group of people, and all the Arabic peoples around them perhaps are people that have some different customs. They don't keep kosher. They don't circumcise. They don't do the things that are part of this covenant. And so the text could be seen as a way to highlight these distinctions between the Jewish people and their neighbors. So I'm going to leave that there for now. Even though I recounted the story, I would ask that you please go and carefully read through it, because the flavor of the story really needs to be read through the words themselves, not just summarized. So take a look at that, and then I'll provide the next mini lecture afterwards.